The encounter. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the quiet suburban street, the orange glow of its descent painting the sky in fiery hues. Maya Johnson gripped the steering wheel of her modest sedan, her fingers pale from the tension. Her mind buzzed with the usual thoughts of a busy day, errands to run, dinner to prepare, and the soft kicks of her unborn child that served as a constant reminder of the new life she carried. At 5 months pregnant, every action felt purposeful, as though she were already shaping the world her child would enter. The shrill wail of a police siren pierced the air, shattering her moment of contemplation. Her heart jumped as she instinctively glanced in the rearview mirror. The flashing blue and red lights of a patrol car loomed behind her. Confused, Maya slowed to a stop on the side of the road, her stomach twisting with a mixture of fear and uncertainty. She hadn't been speeding, and she hadn't run a red light. What could this possibly be about? She took a deep breath, placing a protective hand over her belly, as if to shield her child from the anxiety coursing through her. She reminded herself of all the advice she'd ever heard about police encounters. Remain calm, comply, and avoid sudden movements. Yet, her pulse quickened as the officer, tall, broad-shouldered, and white, approached her vehicle with measured, deliberate steps. His face was set in a stony expression, his eyes cold and assessing. Maya rolled down her window slightly as he stopped beside her car. "Good afternoon, officer," she said, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. The officer's gaze bore into her. "License and registration," he barked, his tone devoid of courtesy. There was no explanation for the stop, no reassurance, just a command that felt more like a judgment. "Yes, sir." Maya reached for her purse, her movements slow and deliberate. Her fingers trembled as she retrieved the requested documents. She handed them over, forcing a polite smile onto her lips. "May I ask why I was pulled over?" she ventured, her voice soft. The officer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared at her with a narrowed gaze, his lips curling into a faint, disdainful sneer. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered abruptly. Maya froze. Her heart skipped a beat, the air around her suddenly feeling too thin to breathe. "Officer, she began, her voice faltering. "Step out of the car," he snapped, his voice sharp enough to make her flinch. His hand rested on his belt, unnervingly close to the baton hanging there. Maya's mind raced. What had she done wrong? Why was he escalating the situation? She wanted to explain, to protest, but the intensity in his eyes told her that reasoning would be futile. Instead, she swallowed hard and did as she was told, opening the car door and stepping onto the pavement. Her legs felt unsteady beneath her, the weight of her pregnancy making her movements slow and cumbersome. She held her hands in front of her, palms open, trying to project compliance. "Officer, I'm pregnant," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She hoped the words would evoke some sense of humanity in him, some recognition of her vulnerability. His expression didn't change. If anything, his jaw tightened, and he stepped closer, his towering figure casting a shadow over her. "I don't care," he said coldly. "Keep your hands where I can see them." Tears pricked at the corners of Maya's eyes, but she blinked them away, refusing to let them fall. She had to stay strong, for herself and for her baby. Her breath came in shallow gasps as the officer circled her car, his eyes scanning her and her vehicle as if searching for something, anything, to justify his actions. The silence stretched, oppressive and suffocating. Maya's heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing like a drum in her ears. She glanced down the empty street, praying for someone to pass by, someone to witness what was happening. But the road remained desolate, the only sound the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. The officer stopped in front of her again, his eyes narrowing as he gestured toward her car. "What are you hiding?" he demanded. "Hiding?" Maya repeated, her voice breaking. "I'm not hiding anything. I've done nothing wrong." He didn't respond, his gaze dark and unreadable. The seconds ticked by, each one heavier than the last. Finally, he said, "Officer, I'm pregnant." She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. "What are you hiding?" he demanded. "Hiding?" Maya repeated, her voice breaking. "I'm not hiding anything. I've done nothing wrong." He didn't respond, his gaze dark and unreadable. The seconds ticked by, each one heavier than the last. Maya felt trapped, her options dwindling. She couldn't run. She wouldn't risk her baby's safety. She couldn't argue. She knew it would only make things worse. As the officer reached for his radio, a new sound broke the tension. The hum of an approaching car engine. Maya turned her head, her heart leaping with a mixture of hope and dread. A sleek black car slowed to a stop behind a patrol car, its tinted windows gleaming in the fading sunlight. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall and imposing, dressed in a sharp suit that contrasted with the casual attire of the neighborhood. His expression was calm, but his dark eyes burned with quiet intensity. Maya didn't recognize him, but there was something about his presence that made her feel, for the first time, that she wasn't alone. The man walked toward them with deliberate steps, his gaze fixed on the officer. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice low and steady. The officer stiffened, his posture rigid as he turned to face the newcomer. "This is a routine stop," he replied curtly. "Please stay back." The man didn't move. Instead, he looked past the officer, his eyes meeting Maya's. "Are you all right?" he asked, his tone softening just slightly. Maya hesitated, her voice caught in her throat. She nodded faintly, not trusting herself to speak. The man's presence was both reassuring and unnerving, a calm force in the storm of her fear. The officer stepped between them, his hand still hovering near his belt. "I said, stay back," he repeated, his tone sharp. The man ignored him. "She's pregnant," he said, his voice firm. "There's no reason for this to escalate." The officer's jaw clenched, his frustration evident. "Sir, I need you to step away. Now." The man's gaze didn't waver. "And I need you to treat her with the respect she deserves," he said, his tone unyielding. "Because if you don't, you'll have far bigger problems than this so-called routine stop." For a moment, the air seemed to crackle with tension, the unspoken challenge hanging heavy between them. Maya held her breath, her eyes darting between the two men. She didn't know who this stranger was, but his calm defiance gave her a flicker of hope, a hope she clung to desperately as the encounter teetered on the edge of chaos. The turning point. Maya stood frozen, her body trembling with fear and exhaustion, while the strange man stood his ground. His calm, authoritative demeanor contrasted sharply with the officer's growing tension. The sharp angle of the sun cast long shadows across the street, making the moment feel like a scene from a movie, suspended in a timeless tableau of fear, uncertainty, and defiance. The officer's fingers twitched near his belt, brushing against the baton at his side. His jaw was tight, his expression hardening as if steeling himself for a confrontation. "Sir, this is an active investigation," he said, his voice clipped and laced with irritation. "I'm going to ask you one more time to step away." The man didn't flinch. Instead, he raised his hand slightly, a gesture of peace that somehow didn't compromise his imposing presence. "Active investigation," he echoed, his tone skeptical. "She's a pregnant woman, not a threat. What exactly do you think you're investigating?" Maya's heart pounded in her chest as she watched the interaction. She clutched her stomach protectively, the faint flutter of her baby's movements grounding her amidst the chaos. Her eyes darted between the two men, unsure of what would happen next. She didn't know who this stranger was or why he had intervened, but something about him exuded a quiet power that demanded attention. The officer squared his shoulders, his posture radiating authority. "I don't have to explain myself to you," he snapped, his voice rising slightly. "This is a matter of law enforcement, and I'm doing my job." "Your job," the man said, his voice calm but edged with steel. "Your job is to serve and protect. Tell me, officer, how exactly are you protecting this woman and her unborn child by threatening her on the side of the road?" The officer's face reddened, a vein throbbing at his temple. His gaze flicked to Maya, then back to the man, as if weighing his options. The silence between them stretched, thick with unspoken tension. The only sound was the faint rustle of leaves in the wind, a stark contrast to the charged atmosphere. Before the officer could respond, the man took a step closer, his movements deliberate but unthreatening. "Let me be clear," he said, his voice dropping to a low, commanding tone. "I'm not here to argue. I'm here to make sure this stops before it gets worse. You've already crossed a line by escalating a situation that didn't need escalating. I suggest you take a moment to reconsider your actions." The officer hesitated, his hand hovering near his baton. Maya held her breath, her pulse racing as she watched the standoff. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, the outcome teetering on a knife's edge. Then, as if sensing the shift in power, the officer stepped back slightly. His posture was still tense, but the defiance in his eyes had dimmed. "Fine," he muttered, his voice begrudging. "But I'll be filing a report." The man didn't acknowledge the officer's words. Instead, he turned to Maya, his expression softening. "Are you all right?" he asked gently. Maya nodded, though her legs felt like they might give out beneath her at any moment. I think so," she said, her voice shaky. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. "Who are you?" He smiled faintly, the first hint of warmth breaking through his serious demeanor. "My name is David," he said, "and I'm your husband." Maya's breath caught in her throat, her mind struggling to process his words. "Husband." She stared at him, her thoughts racing. She had never seen this man before in her life, yet there was something about him, something familiar, yet unplaceable. "Your husband," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. David nodded. "It's a long story," he said. "But right now, the important thing is that you're safe." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a badge, holding it up for her to see. "I'm also an attorney, and I promise you, no one is going to harm you or your baby while I'm here." Maya felt a wave of relief wash over her, mingled with confusion and disbelief. Her mind reeled with questions, but before she could voice them, the second officer, who had remained silent until now, spoke up. "Sir," the second officer said, his tone cautious, "if you're her attorney, then you know this is highly irregular. We can't just walk away from this." David turned to face him, his expression hardening once more. "What's irregular," he said evenly, "is how this entire situation has been handled. You have no probable cause, no justification for pulling her over, and no reason to escalate the situation to this point. I suggest you leave before you dig yourselves into a deeper hole." The second officer hesitated, glancing at his partner for guidance. Jenkins, however, seemed to have lost his resolve. He muttered something under his breath, then turned and walked back to his patrol car. The second officer followed, though his expression was one of uncertainty rather than defeat. Maya watched as the two patrol cars pulled away, their flashing lights fading into the distance. The street fell silent once more, the oppressive tension dissipating like a storm that had passed. David turned back to her, his expression softening once more. "It's over," he said gently. "You're safe now." Maya stared at him, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. Relief, gratitude, confusion, and disbelief, all fought for dominance, leaving her feeling unsteady and overwhelmed. "I don't understand," she said finally, her voice trembling. "Who are you? How did you know I was here?" David hesitated, a flicker of something, hesitation, perhaps, crossing his face. "Like I said, it's a long story," he said. "But for now, let's get you home. You've been through enough." Maya nodded slowly, too exhausted to argue. As she climbed back into her car, her mind raced with questions. Who was this man who had appeared out of nowhere to save her? How did he know her? And why did he claim to be her husband? As David walked back to his own car and started the engine, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that her life had just taken a turn she could never have anticipated. And as she followed him down the quiet, shadowed street, she couldn't help but wonder what other revelations lay ahead. The revelation. The drive back home was silent, save for the hum of the engine and the occasional soft kick from the baby within Maya. Her fingers clutched the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white as her mind spiraled with unanswered questions. Ahead of her, the sleek black car David had arrived in led the way, its taillights glowing faintly in the dimming light of the evening. Her thoughts ran wild, alternating between relief and confusion. Who was this man who had come to her rescue with such authority and composure? He claimed to be her husband, yet she had no memory of him. And why had he been there at that exact moment, as though he had known she was in danger? As they pulled into the driveway of her modest home, David stepped out of his car with the same calm assurance that had unnerved Officer Jenkins. He waited for her to park before walking over to her, opening her door with the kind of practiced ease that suggested familiarity. "Let's go inside," he said, his voice low and steady. "You need to sit down and drink some water." Maya hesitated but nodded, too emotionally drained to argue. She stepped out of the car, clutching her belly protectively, and allowed David to guide her to the front door. Her hands trembled as she unlocked it, the weight of the day's events pressing down on her like a lead blanket. Once inside, David gestured for her to sit on the couch. "I'll get you some water," he said, heading toward the kitchen, as though he knew the layout of her home. Maya sank into the cushions, her body finally succumbing to the exhaustion she'd been holding at bay. Her eyes followed him as he moved with quiet confidence, retrieving a glass and filling it from the tap. He returned and handed it to her, his expression softening as he sat across from her in the armchair. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Maya sipped the water, her hands trembling slightly, while David watched her with a calm, measured gaze. The silence was heavy, leaden with unspoken questions and an odd sense of familiarity that she couldn't place. Finally, Maya broke the silence. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "And why did you call yourself my husband?" David leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His hands were clasped together, his expression serious but not unkind. "Before I answer that," he said, "I need you to know that you're safe now. What happened back there was unacceptable, and I won't let anything like that happen to you again." Maya's brow furrowed. "I appreciate what you did," she said, her voice tinged with hesitation. "But that doesn't explain how you knew where I was or why you claimed to be my husband. I've never met you before." David sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. For the first time, he looked uncertain, as though choosing his words carefully. "You're right," he admitted. "You don't know me. Not yet, but I've been keeping an eye on you for some time now." Maya stiffened, her grip on the glass tightening. "Keeping an eye on me," she echoed, her voice rising slightly. "What does that mean? Are you stalking me?" "No," David said quickly, his tone firm but not defensive. "It's not like that. I promise you, I'm here to protect you." Maya's eyes narrowed. "Protect me from what?" David hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor for a moment before meeting hers again. "From people like Officer Jenkins," he said. "From a system that sees you as a target instead of a person. From anyone who would try to harm you or your child." The sincerity in his voice gave her pause, but it wasn't enough to quell the storm of questions swirling in her mind. "That doesn't answer my question," she said. "Who are you really? And why do you care what happens to me?" David leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "My name is David Alston," he said. "I'm an attorney who specializes in civil rights cases. I've been following your story because I know what it's like to be targeted for who you are." Maya frowned, her confusion deepening. "Following my story? What story? I'm just a regular person trying to live my life." David smiled faintly, but there was a sadness in his eyes. "You might see yourself that way," he said, "but you're more than that. You're a symbol of resilience, of strength. The way you've navigated this world, carrying your child with so much hope and determination. It's inspiring." Maya stared at him, her emotions warring between skepticism and gratitude. "That still doesn't explain why you called yourself my husband," she said, "or how you knew I was in trouble." David's expression softened. "I called myself your husband because, in that moment, It was the fastest way to de-escalate the situation, he said. It gave me authority to intervene, to protect you. As for how I knew, let's just say I've been keeping close tabs on you ever since I heard about your pregnancy. Maya's eyes widened, a chill running down her spine. That's not comforting, she said, her voice sharp. It's creepy. Why would you be keeping tabs on me? David held up his hands, his expression earnest. I understand how it sounds, he said, but I promise you, it's not what you think. I didn't mean to invade your privacy. I felt a responsibility to make sure you were safe. Maya shook her head, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. This is too much, she said. I don't even know you, and now you're telling me you've been watching me, protecting me. Why? What makes me so special? David hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor again. When he looked up, there was a flicker of something vulnerable and raw, in his eyes. Because, he said softly, I know what it's like to grow up without a parent, and I couldn't bear the thought of your child losing you. Maya's breath caught in her throat. The sincerity in his voice was undeniable, and for the first time, she felt a glimmer of understanding. This man, whoever he was, truly believed he was helping her. But the question remained. Before she could press him further, David stood, his movements slow and deliberate. I know this is a lot to take in, he said, and I don't expect you to trust me right away. But I want you to know that I'm here for you, Maya, for you and your child, and I'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe. With that, he turned and headed for the door, leaving Maya alone with her thoughts. As the door closed behind him, she stared at the spot where he had stood, her mind racing with questions and emotions she couldn't untangle. Who was David Alston, really? And why did he care so much about her and her unborn child? Maya didn't know the answers, but one thing was certain: her life was no longer the same. And she had a feeling that David was just the beginning of the changes to come. Unveiling the past. Maya sat in her living room long after David had left, her thoughts swirling in a chaotic storm. The events of the day played over and over in her mind. The tense encounter with Officer Jenkins, David's sudden intervention, and the strange, almost protective energy he exuded. It didn't make sense. None of it did. The house felt unnervingly quiet. Normally, the gentle movements of her unborn child provided comfort, but tonight they felt like a reminder of how precarious her world had become. Her fingers brushed absently over her belly as she stared at the door David had walked through, wondering if she should call someone. A friend. The police. But then she remembered the icy hostility in Officer Jenkins' eyes and shuddered. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, pulling her out of her thoughts. She picked it up and saw a text from an unknown number. Maya, it's David. I know you have questions, and I want to answer them. Meet me at the park on Pine Street tomorrow at 10 a.m. I'll explain everything. Maya stared at the message, her chest tightening. She debated ignoring it, blocking the number and trying to forget the strange man who had suddenly entered her life. But deep down, she knew she couldn't. There was something about him, something in the way he had looked at her, spoken to her, that made her believe he was telling the truth, or at least his version of it. She set the phone down and exhaled slowly, resolving to sleep on it. Yet, as the hours passed and the moonlight shifted across her bedroom, sleep eluded her. When dawn broke, Maya found herself already dressed, the decision made. The park on Pine Street was quiet that morning, the crisp air carrying the earthy scent of fallen leaves. Maya arrived a few minutes early, her nerves taut as she scanned the area for David. She spotted him near a bench beneath a large oak tree, his suit replaced with a simple shirt and jacket that somehow made him seem less intimidating. He stood when he saw her, offering a tentative smile. "Thank you for coming," he said, his tone sincere. Maya nodded, her arms crossed over her chest. "I almost didn't," she admitted. "You have a lot of explaining to do." David gestured to the bench. "Please, sit," he said. "This will take some time." Maya hesitated but eventually sat down, her posture stiff. David sat beside her, leaving enough space to show he respected her boundaries. For a moment, he seemed to collect his thoughts, his hands resting on his knees. "I grew up in foster care," he began, his voice quiet but steady. "I never knew my parents. All I had was a file with a few details about my mom. A black woman who worked hard and dreamed big. But there was nothing about my father, not even a name." Maya blinked, caught off guard by the vulnerability in his words. "What does that have to do with me?" she asked. David looked at her, his dark eyes filled with an emotion she couldn't quite place. "A few years ago, I started digging into my past," he said. "I wanted to know where I came from, who my parents were. That's when I found out about my mother's family. She had a younger sister, your mother." Maya's breath hitched. "My mother," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. David nodded. "That makes us cousins," he said. "I didn't know about you until I found your mother's obituary. It mentioned you, her only daughter, pregnant and living alone. I wanted to reach out, but I didn't know how. Then I heard about the tensions in your area and decided I couldn't wait any longer." Maya stared at him, her mind racing to process his words. Her mother had never mentioned a sister, let alone a nephew. The idea that she had family she didn't know about was both thrilling and unsettling. "So, you're saying we're related?" she asked, her tone skeptical. David nodded again. "I know it's a lot to take in," he said, "but I did a DNA test to confirm it. You and I share the same maternal lineage." Maya leaned back, her heart pounding. "Why didn't my mom ever tell me about her sister?" she asked. "Why would she keep something like that from me?" David hesitated, his expression pained. "From what I've pieced together, my mom left the family when she was young," he said. "She made some bad choices, got involved with the wrong people. Your mom probably wanted to protect you from that part of her past." Maya's chest tightened at the thought. Her mother had always been a pillar of strength and stability in her life, someone who worked tirelessly to provide for her and teach her right from wrong. The idea that she had carried a hidden pain, a secret burden, was almost too much to bear. "I don't know what to say," she admitted, her voice shaky. "This is all so sudden." David offered a small smile. "I understand," he said. "I just want you to know that I'm here for you, Maya. You're not alone in this." She looked at him, studying his face for any signs of deception. But all she saw was sincerity and a quiet determination that mirrored her own. For the first time, she felt a flicker of hope that she wasn't as isolated as she had believed. Over the next hour, David shared more about his journey, how he had climbed out of the foster care system to become a successful attorney, driven by a desire to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. He told her about the people he had helped, the injustices he had witnessed, and the reason he had stepped in during her encounter with Officer Jenkins. "I've seen too many people suffer because no one was there to stand up for them," he said. "When I saw what was happening to you, I couldn't just stand by, especially knowing your family." Maya listened, her emotions shifting from disbelief to gratitude. By the time he finished, she felt as though a piece of her life she hadn't even known was missing had fallen into place. But there were still questions, uncertainties that gnawed at her. "What happens now?" she asked. "Do we just go back to our lives like none of this happened?" David shook his head. "No," he said firmly. "I want to be a part of your life, if you'll let me. You don't have to face this alone, Maya. You and your baby deserve better." Maya's eyes welled with tears, the weight of the past day finally catching up to her. For so long, she had carried the burden of being alone, of navigating a world that often felt hostile and unforgiving. But now, for the first time, she felt the warmth of connection. A connection she hadn't expected but desperately needed. "I don't know what the future holds," she said, her voice trembling. "But I think I'd like to get to know you." David smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen from him. "I'd like that too," he said, one step at a time. As they stood to leave, Maya felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, she didn't feel as though she had to walk it alone. The battle for dignity. The next few weeks felt like a whirlwind of emotions and revelations for Maya. David became a steady presence in her life, showing up with quiet determination to offer support, guidance, and protection. He was careful not to overstep, respecting her boundaries while slowly building a bridge of trust between them. Yet, despite his good intentions, Maya couldn't shake the lingering fear and unease from her encounter with Officer Jenkins. The incident had left a mark on her, not just as a terrifying memory, but as a reminder of the precariousness of her existence as a black woman in a world that often saw her as a target. The thought that her unborn child might inherit that same vulnerability haunted her. It wasn't enough to simply move on. She needed to take action. One morning, as the autumn sunlight streamed through her kitchen window, Maya sat across from David at the small dining table. Her fingers traced the rim of her coffee mug as she wrestled with her thoughts. Finally, she looked up, her gaze steady. "I want to file a complaint against Officer Jenkins," she said. David's eyebrows lifted slightly, but he didn't seem surprised. "You're sure about this?" he asked, his tone measured. "It won't be easy. Complaints against law enforcement can be met with resistance." Maya nodded, determination hardening her features. "I can't just let it go," she said. "He treated me like I was less than human. I don't want anyone else to go through what I did." David leaned back in his chair, studying her for a moment. "If this is what you want, I'll stand with you," he said. "But we need to be prepared. These things can get messy, and the system isn't always on the side of justice." Maya's jaw tightened. "I don't care how messy it gets," she said. "I have to do this. For me, for my baby, and for anyone who's ever been in my shoes." David wasted no time getting to work. Over the next few days, he gathered evidence, including the dashcam footage from Officer Jenkins' patrol car. Maya's heart raced as she watched the video, the grainy images bringing back the fear and helplessness she had felt during the encounter. But it also reignited her resolve. This wasn't just about her. It was about standing up against a system that allowed people like Jenkins to abuse their power. David also arranged for Maya to speak with a journalist he trusted, a woman named Camille who had a reputation for exposing corruption. Camille met with Maya at a quiet cafe, her notebook and recorder at the ready. Her sharp eyes and warm demeanor put Maya at ease, and before long, she found herself recounting her story in detail. As she spoke, Maya realized just how much she had been holding in. The fear, the anger, the exhaustion of constantly being on guard. Tears streamed down her face as she described the way Officer Jenkins had looked at her, as though she were a criminal rather than a pregnant woman just trying to get home. Camille reached across the table, her hand resting lightly on Maya's. "Thank you for sharing this," she said. "Your story deserves to be heard." The article ran a week later, accompanied by an op-ed calling for accountability in law enforcement. The headline read, "Pregnant Woman Harassed During Routine Traffic Stop. A Call for Justice." The story quickly gained traction, sparking conversations on social media and drawing attention from advocacy groups. Messages of support poured in from strangers who had read about Maya's ordeal, each one a reminder that she wasn't alone in her fight. But not all the attention was positive. Anonymous comments on the article accused Maya of exaggerating or lying, while others defended Officer Jenkins' actions as just doing his job. The backlash stung, but Maya refused to let it deter her. She focused on the people who stood with her, drawing strength from their encouragement. David, meanwhile, worked tirelessly to prepare for the formal complaint hearing. He coached Maya on how to present her case, ensuring she felt confident and prepared. They spent hours reviewing the evidence, going over her testimony, until she knew it by heart. "Remember," David said during one of their late-night sessions, "this isn't just about telling your story. It's about holding the system accountable. You have the truth on your side, and that's more powerful than anything they can throw at you." The day of the hearing arrived with a crisp chill in the air. Maya dressed carefully, choosing a simple navy dress that emphasized her growing belly. She stood in front of the mirror, taking a deep breath as she smoothed her hands over the fabric. This was it, the moment she had been preparing for. David drove her to the courthouse, his presence a calming anchor amidst the storm of her nerves. As they walked into the hearing room, Maya felt the weight of every gaze that turned toward her. She straightened her spine, refusing to shrink under their scrutiny. The hearing was tense and grueling, with Officer Jenkins' lawyer attempting to discredit Maya at every turn. He questioned her memory of the events, suggested she had been uncooperative, and even implied that her pregnancy had made her overly emotional. Maya clenched her fists beneath the table, anger simmering in her chest. But David was relentless. He countered every argument with facts, his voice steady and commanding as he presented the evidence. He played the dashcam footage, the chilling sound of Jenkins' harsh commands echoing through the room. He pointed out the inconsistencies in Jenkins' report and highlighted Maya's calm and compliant behavior throughout the encounter. When it was Maya's turn to speak, she took a deep breath and looked directly at the panel of reviewers. "I'm here today because I believe in justice," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I believe that no one, no matter their race, gender, or circumstances, should be made to feel like they don't matter. What happened to me wasn't just an abuse of power. It was an attack on my dignity, and I won't stand for it." Her words hung in the air, resonating with a quiet power that silenced even her detractors. The hearing concluded, and the panel retired to deliberate. The wait was agonizing, every passing minute stretching like an eternity. Maya sat beside David, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She glanced at him, finding comfort in his calm expression. Finally, the panel returned with their decision. Officer Jenkins would face disciplinary action and mandatory sensitivity training. It wasn't the sweeping victory Maya had hoped for, but it was a step forward, a small but significant crack in the armor of a flawed system. As they left the courthouse, Maya felt a wave of relief wash over her. The fight wasn't over, but she had taken a stand, and that meant something. She turned to David, her gratitude shining in her eyes. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." David smiled, his gaze warm. "You did this, Maya," he said. "You stood up for yourself and your baby. That's more powerful than anything I could have done." Maya nodded, her hand resting on her belly. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of peace. The road ahead would be difficult, but she knew she wasn't walking it alone. And that made all the difference. The path forward. The days that followed the hearing felt like a slow, deliberate exhale. Maya had emerged victorious, but the weight of what she had just accomplished settled heavily on her shoulders. Justice had been served, but there was still so much work to be done. She had taken the first step in reclaiming her dignity, but she knew this battle was only one chapter in a much larger story. David continued to be a constant in her life, his unwavering support a comforting presence that grounded her. They spent hours together, discussing the future, sharing stories of their pasts, and slowly building a relationship that felt like it was years in the making. Maya found herself opening up to him in ways she hadn't even realized she could. She talked about her fears for her child's future, about the legacy of fear that hung over every black mother in America. And David listened, always offering the same steady reassurance. "You are not alone." But even as she began to heal from the trauma of the traffic stop and the hearing, the harsh reality of the world outside her home still pressed in on her. Despite the small victory, Maya knew that the battle for justice was far from over. She had seen firsthand the power dynamics at play, the ways in which people like Officer Jenkins could abuse their authority with little fear of repercussion. The system, she realized, was much larger than any individual encounter. It was an entrenched force that needed to be dismantled piece by piece. Maya was no longer content to be a passive observer. She had tasted the power of speaking out, of standing up for what was right, and it had ignited a fire inside her that she couldn't ignore. There was so much more she could do. Her own experiences had made her a witness to the inequities that black people faced every day. But now she felt a deep, unshakable responsibility to turn her pain into action. It was a week after the hearing when David approached her with a proposal. They were sitting together on the porch, the autumn air crisp and carrying the faint scent of wood smoke. Maya was rocking gently in the chair, her hands resting on her stomach as she looked out at the quiet street. "I've been thinking," David began, his voice hesitant but earnest, "about what comes next, about how you're not just a victim of this system, but someone who has the power to change it. We've both seen how the laws are manipulated, how people with power abuse it, and how the truth often gets buried. But I think you could make a real difference, Maya. And I think we should help you do that." Maya turned to him, her heart quickening. "What do you mean?" she asked, the question heavy with unspoken possibilities. "I want to help you build a platform," David said, his eyes filled with purpose. "You've got a voice, Maya, and I think it's time for you to use it. You've got the experience, the passion, and the determination. If you're willing to speak out, I'll help you amplify your message. We can start a movement. We can fight for those who've been silenced." Maya's breath caught in her throat. She had always known that something needed to change, but she had never imagined that she could be the one to push for that change. The weight of it settled on her, but it was a weight that felt empowering, not oppressive. She thought of the countless stories she had heard from friends, family, and strangers, stories of harassment, of injustice, of being forced to fight for basic dignity. Could she really be the one to give a voice to all of them? "I don't know if I'm ready for all of that," Maya admitted, her fingers tracing the cool edge of her coffee mug. "I'm just one person. What if I fail?" David smiled gently, the kind of smile that conveyed deep understanding. "You're already more than one person, Maya. You're someone who's shown the world that silence is not an option. Every time you speak, you're giving others permission to do the same. You've already started this movement. You just need to step into it now." Maya sat in silence, contemplating his words. It felt like a daunting challenge, but she also felt a sense of responsibility that she couldn't deny. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the millions of people whose voices had been stifled by a system that ignored their humanity. Could she be the one to challenge that system, to build something that would outlast her own experience? A few days later, Maya stood in front of a microphone at a local rally, surrounded by a crowd of supporters and fellow activists. It had taken her weeks to work up the courage to speak publicly about her experience, to stand in front of a group of people and share her truth. But with David by her side, guiding her, the fear that had once gripped her now felt like a distant memory. She looked out over the sea of faces, their eyes fixed on her, waiting for her to speak. For a moment, everything went silent. It wasn't the nervous kind of silence that made her throat close in fear. It was the kind of silence that came from expectation, from a shared understanding that what she was about to say mattered. Maya took a deep breath and began. "I'm here today because I refuse to be invisible," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I'm here because I refuse to let anyone, especially a law enforcement officer, define who I am or how I deserve to be treated. I'm here because I'm not the only one who's been harassed, who's been treated like a threat instead of a human being. There are so many of us, so many voices that go unheard, so many stories that never get told. But I'm not staying silent anymore." The crowd erupted into applause, but Maya wasn't done. She continued, her words gaining strength with each sentence. "We've been conditioned to believe that we don't matter, that we're expendable. But that ends now. I'm fighting for my child, for my community, and for every person who has been denied their basic rights. We are not your stereotypes. We are not your fears. We are human beings, and we will be treated with the dignity we deserve." The cheers grew louder, and Maya felt a surge of empowerment rush through her. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about all of them. The people who had been silenced, the people who had been treated like they were invisible. She had stepped into something bigger than herself, and it felt both terrifying and exhilarating. David stood behind her, his hand resting gently on her back, a silent reassurance that she wasn't alone. The crowd's energy was palpable, and for the first time, Maya felt like she was part of something much larger than any individual battle. This was the beginning of a movement, a call for change that would echo far beyond this rally, far beyond her own experience. Over the next few months, Maya became a fierce advocate for justice. With David's help, she created an organization dedicated to supporting individuals who had faced discrimination or police brutality. They offered resources, legal aid, and a platform for people to share their stories. It wasn't just about one case or one encounter. It was about a movement that aimed to reshape how society viewed people like her. And through it all, Maya never stopped fighting for her child's future. Every step she took, every speech she gave, and every story she shared was a step toward creating a world where her baby would never have to face the same fears she had. The road was long, and there were many battles to fight. But Maya knew one thing for sure. She wasn't backing down. Not for herself, and not for the generations to come. As Maya's voice began to rise in her community, so too did the challenges she faced. The rally had been just the beginning, a powerful moment of visibility. But now, the real work began. Her organization, Rise for Justice, quickly grew in influence, attracting supporters from all walks of life. Activists, lawyers, parents, students, and even people who simply believed in equality. David continued to stand by her side, offering legal expertise and guidance. Together, they worked to organize protests, town hall meetings, and public awareness campaigns. They were determined to change the system, to demand accountability and force society to confront the realities that so many had ignored for far too long. But despite the momentum, the opposition grew fiercer. People who felt threatened by Maya's growing influence began to push back, calling her a troublemaker, a voice of division. They questioned her motives, accusing her of trying to incite unrest. The media's portrayal of her was often skewed, focused on her defiance and bold statements, rather than the heart of her message, a call for dignity and equality. Maya didn't let it deter her. If anything, the criticism only strengthened her resolve. She knew that change was never easy, and that the path to justice was always met with resistance. It was the price she had to pay to ensure a better future for her child, and for others like her. One afternoon, as Maya sat at her desk reviewing a set of legal documents, a phone call interrupted her thoughts. She glanced at the caller ID and saw it was David. Her heart skipped a beat. He rarely called unless something urgent had come up. Maya. David's voice was tight, tinged with concern. I need you to listen to me carefully. We've got a situation. The city council has just announced they're cutting funding for police reform programs. This could be a huge setback for everything we've worked for. Maya stood up immediately, her pulse quickening. What do we do? She asked, her voice unwavering despite the panic rising in her chest. We need to act fast. We have a limited window of time before the council votes, David explained. I'm going to arrange a meeting with some of the key leaders in the reform movement. We need to mobilize, put pressure on the council, and make them see that their actions have consequences. Maya's mind raced. This wasn't just about fighting for justice anymore. It was about preventing a setback that could undo all their progress. The thought of the years of work being erased with a single vote made her stomach churn. We'll rally, she said decisively. I'll speak at the next council meeting. We can't let this slip by. The next few days were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and strategy sessions. Maya and David worked tirelessly, organizing a series of peaceful protests that would culminate at the council meeting. Activists, citizens, and supporters gathered in droves, their energy infectious and their resolve unshakable. As the day of the vote arrived, the atmosphere at the council chambers was electric. Protesters filled the streets outside, chanting for justice, for accountability, for a future free from the fear and inequality that had plagued their lives for too long. Inside the chambers, city council members prepared to cast their votes, but Maya knew the real power lay in the voices outside. David stood beside her as they watched the crowd from a distance. "This is it," he said quietly, his hand resting on her shoulder. "You've done more than anyone could have hoped for, but we still have one final fight." Maya nodded, her gaze fixed on the sea of faces in the crowd. Each one of them was there for a reason. Some were there for their own children, their own communities, while others had come to support the movement she had started. She thought of her own baby growing inside her, and the world she was fighting to create for that child. When the time came, Maya stood at the podium, facing the council members. The room fell into a hushed silence as she stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly, but her voice unwavering. "Good evening," she began, her eyes scanning the room filled with decision-makers. "I stand before you today, not just as a woman who has faced injustice, but as a mother who fears for the future of her child. I stand before you as a Black woman who has spent too many years feeling powerless in the face of a system that does not see me, that does not hear me, and that has long turned a blind eye to the suffering of my people." Her words hung in the air, the weight of them settling over the room. "I'm not here to ask for your sympathy. I'm not here to beg for mercy. I'm here to demand respect. I'm here to demand that you do what is right. You have the power to make a choice, to choose whether we will continue down the same destructive path, or whether we will create a future where every person, regardless of the color of their skin, can walk in this world with dignity and safety." Maya's voice grew stronger as she spoke, her passion evident in every syllable. "We are not criminals. We are not statistics. We are not your scapegoats. We are human beings, and we deserve to be treated with the same respect and humanity that you afford to others." The room was still, the silence almost oppressive. She could feel the weight of every eye on her, but she didn't flinch. She had a message, and it was going to be heard. "I am here because I believe in justice," she continued, her voice now a steady, resolute force. "I believe that the only way we can move forward is if we acknowledge the truth, if we face the inequalities that have been ingrained in our society for far too long. This is not a moment for empty promises or political games. This is a moment for action." Maya paused, allowing her words to sink in. "We will not stand idly by. We will fight for what is right. And we will not rest until our children can grow up in a world where their lives matter, where their futures are not dictated by fear, but by hope." As she finished, the room erupted in applause, and the crowd outside cheered in unison. The council members sat in stunned silence, visibly shaken by her words. Maya knew it wasn't enough to change their minds with just one speech, but it was a step. It was a start. The following weeks were a blur of meetings and pressure. Despite the initial pushback from certain council members, the momentum Maya had built could not be ignored. The vote came down to the wire, but in the end, the council voted to reinstate funding for police reform programs, though it wasn't without compromise. Maya stood with David as the news broke. It wasn't a perfect victory, but it was a victory nonetheless, a tangible, hard-won step toward change. And for the first time, Maya allowed herself to feel a sense of accomplishment. As they watched the news coverage, Maya felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She had done it. She had fought, and she had won. David turned to her, a proud smile on his face. "You did it, Maya. You didn't back down." Maya smiled, her hand resting on her belly, feeling the tiny movements of her child. "We did it," she said softly. "Together." The future was still uncertain, but Maya had no doubt that she would keep fighting. She would keep standing up for the dignity of every person who had been silenced, every person who had been denied their humanity. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, Maya felt that they were on the right path, the path forward. And with that, she knew that no matter what came next, she would never stop fighting for a better world for her child, for her community, and for the generations to come.